Welcome back to another week of Learn with Flo. We're going to continue on with our symptom series that we've been diving into this month of June, all the way from really digging into some of the behind the scenes things that I see on a lot of patient and client intake forms, because I think it's worthy of having some of these conversations on a bigger scale and getting more people involved with how I like to speak about the ways that our body communicates with us, right? So we talked about energy levels, we talked about anxiety, last week we talked about brain fog, and this week we're going to be coming in hot and heavy with a very popular topic that comes up, which is the symptom of cravings and appetite changes. I guess some people kind of think of this as a symptom. Other people might just think of it as a nuance, but it is one of the many ways that our body does try to communicate with us on a daily basis. And so especially in this world, and we'll kind of touch on this a little bit today too, but in a world that really forces a lot of us to disconnect our brain from our bodies in various senses of the word, we really have to understand how our body is trying desperately every day to get our attention. And it's really, really key and insightful information if we know how to listen to it and we know how to interpret it. But if we're just running around with our heads cut off in this mode that every symptom that comes from our body is an emergency and just a nuisance and just make it go away and shut it off, that's that quick fix mentality coming through. That's kind of that instant gratification, which we know never lasts, right? We all know it, but we do it anyway. So this is me wanting to really implore you to say, hey, why don't we just pause for a second? Why don't we start to really listen to our body cues and body responses instead of just rushing around and wanting to continue to be able to eat and live and move the way that we do and not have to actually change anything about our day-to-day to feel better, and we just want something that just like magically makes it go away, right? And I think that when we talk about things like craving and appetite in this world, there's so many things that you'll see out there, especially in the thick of diet culture, that really talks about silencing your cravings and suppressing your appetite. And to me, those things really aren't positive or healthy signs, right? It's like, ooh, someone that doesn't have a normal appetite response, I'm worried about that, right? We'll dig into that today. I'm like, I'm starting to listen to these body cues. I'm like, wait, you don't wake up hungry for breakfast? Like, you've just been fasting for the better part of the last 8 to 10 hours and you're not hungry? Like, that's not normal. Like, that's something we should look into. Your body's trying to communicate something, right? Or on the opposite end of the spectrum, it's like someone that never feel satiated. They always feel like they're constantly hungry, constantly snacking. They think it's just their willpower, and so then they go on these crazy diets to try to restrict their food farther, and then they just end up with more binge eating patterns or more disordered eating patterns because they never really listened to what that meant and really dug at it from a root cause, right? And I think even in this world where we're seeing a lot of hype and a lot of focus around the weight loss drugs market, that's essentially what they are, is they're appetite suppressants. They always have been, they always will be. And so with that, there's got to be this understanding that yes, there's a right situation and a perfect candidate for those types of things. But then there's also certain individuals that may not be using those things appropriately and don't really have just a great bead on hunger, appetite, cravings, and how to listen to their body and create that brain-body connection. So I'm all about uniting that. I'm all about let's bring the body back together. You are one whole person all the way from your brain to your toes, and we can't change one part of our body and expect the other part not to compensate in some way, shape, or form, right? So when we talk about the science of craving, we talk about the science of appetite, I want you to recognize that these are some of the first symptoms, just like our body might appear anxious, right? It's like, ooh, that's different, that's a change, I didn't deal with that before, or pain or inflammation, or like we talked about last week, brain fog, energy levels dropping, menstrual cycles changing, libido changing, gut issues that we never used to have, right? It's like all of these things are just signs that our body is trying to communicate with us, and we can't just come in and swoop and think that we're just going to shut everything off and that's the end all be all. So when we talk about the science of cravings and appetite, I want to do a little bit of just definition setting with you guys first, because I think sometimes these terms can kind of be used interchangeably. And so just for our own purposes, I want to be super duper clear about what am I talking about when I talk about cravings? What do I mean when I say things like appetite or hunger, so that you can start to even turn inward. That's what these sessions are all about, is that you start to kind of glean and listen, and you're like, what is my body starting to say about this? And how have I maybe not been interpreting that correctly? And because I wasn't interpreting it correctly, I wasn't necessarily tackling it correctly. And I'm maybe even making the situation worse, right? So I see this time and time again as well too. So when we talk about cravings and appetite, a lot of times those two get used interchangeably. And usually that's because we can kind of confuse one or the other, and a lot of the symptoms can kind of overlap a little bit. Regardless, they are our body's way of communicating kind of this a little bit of lack of control. And we'll come back to the nervous system and what the nervous system means in all of this. But when we notice changes in hunger and appetite, our body is sensing usually a rather large discrepancy somewhere, right? Energy in, energy out, and there's this huge gap that our body feels like instinctually, and for like a safety and survival mechanism, our body rushes us to try to close that gap. Hence, it increases our cravings for calorie-dense foods like carbs and fats, or those comfort foods, and it increases our hunger and our appetite, driving to get us to eat more because it senses this kind of chronic or dangerous energy gap, right? What do we do instead though? We make the energy gap worse, and we think we can just take control into our own hands, and it's like, oh, I'm just going to eat less and move more, right? And it's like the body's like, no, that's not what I asked you to do. I'm quite frankly asking you to do the opposite, but you don't feel like you can really trust your body cues in that aspect, so you take it the opposite direction, and now you're just making it worse, right? So we end up in this really dangerous tailspin if we just try to always like suppress our appetite, or control our appetite, or control our cravings. Instead, let's take a step back and ask a bigger question of what this might be saying about bigger issues going on underneath the surface. So when I talk about appetite changes usually refer to like more or less hunger or satiety from meals, someone that has more of an inability to feel full and satiated, or the opposite direction where someone notices appetite changes to where they're not hungry or they're not eating, even if it makes sense that logically they should be hungry. Like I said, waking up first thing in the morning, I would expect someone to be hungry. Someone working out more, I would expect them to be hungry. Things like that, right? So it's like their normal appetite responses are off, right? Either no hunger or a lot of kind of insatiable hunger in that regard, to where it's very much interrupting their daily quality of life. So that's more appetite changes. Cravings usually refer to more of like physical or mental pulls towards a specific food, irregardless of physical hunger. Like when you want dessert, even though you're physically stuffed, right? It's like, I'm no longer physiologically hungry. I just want that dessert, or I want that cookie, right? That's more of a craving, versus appetite changes are more, sometimes can overlap, because then we fill that extra appetite with not so great foods, right? So some of them can overlap, but I would say appetite changes are going to be more physical hunger differences, either less or more than normal. And then cravings are going to be more mentally driven, because the physiological hunger is no longer there, but the craving is there, right? And I make that important distinction because I talk to my varied clients about this important distinction, so that we can really understand, is it coming from a physical place? Is it a mental place? Is it a little bit of both? Because then guess what? That tells me something different, and therefore the solution will be something slightly different as well too. So appetite versus cravings does give us a little bit more clarity around where this might be coming from, right? Again, we kind of always talk about, it's like, okay, so if I went to my traditional medical doctor with signs of appetite changes, whether more or less, or cravings, usually this type of symptom isn't necessarily the top of their priority list, because it's usually not anything life-threatening, right? It's usually just one of those early red flags that our body's trying to give us, saying that, hey, something bigger is building underneath the surface. I need you to start looking into it, but we might try to ignore it or suppress it, which doesn't do any good. The bigger issue is still building underneath the surface. So unfortunately, from a conventional medicine aspect, we don't really have any certain labs or lab markers that we can run to determine why somebody's appetite might change. It does take more of a skilled practitioner to understand how are we looking at labs, how are we interpreting labs, and what might be contributing maybe to some of those appetite changes. But usually appetite changes aren't happening in a silo. There's usually a lot of other symptoms that a person might be coming in with. And so unfortunately, things like cravings or appetite changes tend to either get kind of pushed off the radar, or they get pushed off to someone in a totally different specialty, and they have you go see a psychologist that is more trained in disordered eating patterns or appetite changes, right? Which is great, and I love that we have those specialties for those individuals, but sometimes even just the day-to-day general population person trying to manage the difference between hunger and appetite, I would rather you know how to take those cues into your own hands, because you're probably not going to get a really great workup if you just walked in with cravings or appetite type changes, right? Versus someone that is more around a holistic approach, or someone that really likes to look at the brain, the body all together as one, would recognize like, yeah, some of those things that you're describing make total sense, especially if we dig deeper into labs, or especially if we kind of take your whole health history into account, right? And all of the other symptoms that you might be discussing on a regular basis. So usually that's why more of a conventional medicine aspect is harder to work on this one, because your options really are, we're going to kind of put that at the bottom of the priority list because there's bigger fish to fry, or we're going to just go ahead and suppress your appetite or stimulate your appetite with prescription medications. Are kind of the two options that you get there, right? Which totally valid for the right individual in the right situation, but not necessarily for everybody, right? Someone that maybe is a cancer patient going through chemo and they have no appetite, like we know they need nourishment, we know they need to eat. So sometimes like something that helps stimulate their appetite a little bit is really helpful, right? Or someone that's dealing with a lot of, past or present trauma issues, or they're dealing with some binge eating tendencies. Yes, some appetite suppressants might be helpful for an individual like that until they can kind of learn how to have other release mechanisms, right? So don't get me wrong, this isn't like a total knock on the pharmaceutical side of things. It's just us recognizing like, are we misusing some of those tools when we really should be understanding, what is my cravings and my hunger saying, and how do I approach this and regulate those things naturally? It's probably my body telling me I'm missing something, or I have too much of something. I'm just not in alignment with my overall health, right? So this is where I think it gets fun, because then we can really talk about, what do cravings start to say about me, and where can I start to kind of find a little bit of something I might be able to relate to here. So I'm going to run through a bunch of different scenarios of why we might experience either increase or decrease appetite, increase, decrease cravings, and you can start to see like, okay, do any of those sound like me, and what some of the root causes underneath those that I would look into if I were in your position. So what do cravings and appetite really try to tell us? Let's just throw out the most popular one, right? A sugar craving. Sugar cravings are usually going to be more thinking along the lines of blood sugar imbalances, right? So someone that tells me, I have had so many individuals that come in, they're like, oh, I have such a sweet tooth. Or other individuals might frame it as like, I have an addiction to sugar, right? And what do? I'm like, what are some things you've tried around that? And they're like, oh, I've done like a 10-day sugar detox. And I'm like, so you just try to shut it off? And I'm like, how did that go? And they're like, oh, I went right back to binging on sugar again. I'm like, yeah, that's because we didn't get to the underlying root cause of why you were craving sugar in the first place. You just decided to deprive yourself from it. And your body's like, oh, okay, here we go. Like, I was trying to communicate something to you, but you just, like I said, weren't listening in that regard. So a lot of times we kind of take some inappropriate actions here. So those sugar cravings, start to think blood sugar imbalances, right? This could be blood sugar highs. This could be blood sugar lows. Other things that a lot of people might feel in this same category is you might feel like easily hangry, like you're someone that needs to eat about every 2 hours, or you feel yourself crash, or you might even know that you deal with some hypoglycemic type symptoms. Like if you don't have a purse snack, you get shaky or irritable, or you get a headache, or maybe recognizing where those sugar cravings might even pop up during different phases of like a woman's menstrual cycle. It's actually normal that a woman is slightly less insulin sensitive in the luteal phase of her cycle, which is about 10 to 14 days before you bleed. And so in that, we get a lot of, I guess, societal jokes around like, oh, you know, you're craving chocolate, you must be like PMSing, right? And it's not invalid, you're not wrong, but a lot of times those sugar cravings are trying to tell us something about the second half of that menstrual cycle, and our body's like, ooh, maybe I don't have a great ovulation cycle, maybe I have low progesterone, maybe I don't quite have a good balance of that progesterone to estrogen ratio, I have some inflammation, all of those types of things, right? Or maybe we're restricting our energy intake so much that in the second half of that cycle, where our body honestly expects us to eat a little bit more, but yet we feel fearful of that as women to listen to that. And so then we try to eat the same diet 30 days out of a month and the exact same calories and the exact same macros. And then every time we come across that PMS, shit hits the fan, our macros go out the window, and we just start again next cycle, right? It's like, ladies, stop. Like, that is not how your body works. Like, you shouldn't eat the same exact macros every single flipping day. Like, that's not how your body works. You will have appetite changes. You will have craving changes. And if you don't know how to play ahead of that, then you're just going to continue to spin your wheels, and chances are probably not going to move forward on very many of your goals if you feel like you're like on your plan for 2 weeks and then off your plan for 2 weeks, right? So we need to know how to stay ahead of that and how to combat that slight insulin sensitivity change in the second half of our cycle by making sure that we're front loading the day with more protein and more fiber, right? And then all of a sudden those sugar cravings go away, and it's like, wow, so it wasn't just I didn't have to blame that on PMS. It was just me not listening to my body cues and body signals. Yes, exactly. So when you think or feel like sugar cravings, whether you're male or female, the things that I definitely would check off the list first is some blood sugar imbalances, making sure that you're drawing things like fasting blood glucose, fasting insulin, hemoglobin A1C, looking at other ancillary markers like your triglycerides, those types of things, right? And or looking at the menstrual cycle and how healthy your menstrual cycle is as well, and making sure that you know how to account for the different phases of your menstrual cycle too, so that that second half of your cycle doesn't always sneak up on you with all of these cravings and all of this extra hunger that then catches you off guard. We end up filling it with more shit, and then we start all over again. So probably not going to work out well. So when you think sugar cravings, blood sugar imbalances, menstrual cycles, right? Now, when you think maybe more like salt cravings, someone that comes in and they're like, oh man, I could pass up the chocolate bar, but slide me those chips. And like, I don't even trust myself to have chips in the house. I don't have a portion size bead on it. I'm going to either eat the whole bag or eat none at all, type of mentality. The salt piece really has me digging or questioning someone's adrenal health picture, right? And this can be kind of related to blood sugar, and adrenals do play hand in hand a little bit as well too. But when I think adrenal dysfunction, I'm starting to think high cortisol to the point where we've burned out and now we have low cortisol, because the adrenals sit right on top of your kidneys, right? And so you can imagine the adrenals being responsible for things like a stress response. So under times of more stress, the adrenals then make us lose a lot of water. The adrenals also make us lose a lot of minerals in that process, right? Minerals are going to be things like sodium, potassium, magnesium, all of those good things. So in an adrenal insufficiency picture, it is not uncommon that someone craves a lot of salt because their body is trying to communicate like, hey, I'm losing minerals like crazy over here. So it's desperately trying to refill those sodium stores in particular, right? So then the more you know about the body and you realize that sodium and potassium balance each other out, then you can kind of correct that, right? And recognize it's like, oh, so I wasn't just like it's just so crazy to me how many people like start to really develop like a whole personality phenotype around their cravings. They're like, oh yeah, I'm just always known as that person that like has chips in her purse. I'm like, is that like a personality trait now? Or is that just like us not recognizing like our body signal? So it's amazing to me how many people have really like changed that. They're like, it wasn't just my personality. It was my body trying to say something, wasn't it? I was like, yes, it was. And it's amazing how much more control and power you can give when you help really put that person back in the driver's seat of their craving. So other things like with the salt cravings, this might also be that person that doesn't wake up with a morning appetite. Maybe someone that like skips meals when they feel like they're chronically stressed. There's kind of two different types of individuals where they kind of like emotionally eat, like they eat more when they're stressed, or people where it kind of like shuts off their appetite response. So usually the salt cravings, the I don't wake up with an appetite type of person, the I skip meals when I'm stressed type of person, it really is just telling us that the body is just putting digestion on the back burner because it is in this like chronic state of survival and safety response that it's trying to deal with first. So we can either continue to fight an uphill battle with these salt cravings and just let it build to a bigger picture, because that adrenal dysfunction will lead to bigger, whether it's blood pressure issues, sexual dysfunction issues, cardiovascular disease issues. I mean, you're just kind of setting the stage there, right? So trying to let you guys in on what your body is trying to tell you a little earlier. So speaking of the adrenals and speaking more of fight or flight, maybe it's not so much sugar cravings for you. Maybe it's not so much like the salt cravings for you. Maybe it's more of like the comfort foods, right? We all have those foods that kind of remind us of childhood or remind us of like a time where we felt like safe and loved at like a grandparent's house or an aunt's house, right? Something that really is kind of like reminiscent to us of a time where our body felt safe and well fueled. That is your brain, that is your nervous system driving you towards those things. Now, usually comfort foods are carbs and fats, right? It's like mac and cheese, or it's like mashed potatoes, or it's ice cream, it's cake, or it's popcorn. Like I've heard lots of different things of like foods that connect people back to childhood or connect us back to like a safe experience. And that is totally normal. There's so many sensory things involved with food, the smells and the tastes, and all of those then plug into our memory, right? And our memory bank is going to tell our nervous system like, hey, we've been in this situation in the past. And when I was in this situation in the past, life was good. I felt great. Everything was happy and fueled, right? So when we can understand this, we don't have to judge ourselves over craving some of those things. We just have to start to recognize when we crave those things, is our body actually just in a chronic state of stress right now and is looking for a time where we felt safe and is craving a time where we felt safe. And so by doing that, it's trying to relate some of those comfort foods to those experiences, right? So everybody can usually kind of relate to like a childhood food or their comfort food, or like whatever you go to when you've had like a bad day. That's it. That's your comfort food. And so because of that, we have to recognize our body in that point in time is in a state of fight or flight. Our nervous system is pegged over there to that more sympathetic side. And so what happens is as our body encounters stressors, we store them and we stuff them and we store them and we stuff them. If we don't have great practices in our day to adequately release stress through daily stress releasing practices, which is part of what I coach all of my clients to learn how to do, we tend to then go back to some of those comfort foods and go back to those childhood habits. It could even be non-childhood habits like wine or alcohol, right? But it's our body looking for things to de-stress. It's not necessarily normal. It doesn't have to be part of your lived experience, but it's also not something to just like shut off or deny yourself. It's starting to recognize like, oh, my body is craving my comfort food. And it's like, that must mean that my stress bucket is getting really, really high, really, really full. I need to pause and I need to do some stress releasing activities, number one. Two, I need to learn how do I honor that craving, but honor it in a balanced way that still meets my health and wellness goals. So it's saying that, oh, so I don't have to eat like a whole box of mac and cheese to get my fill. I can make myself mac and cheese, but like maybe pair some protein and some produce with it. Yeah, that would be a much better way to start to intercept that and start to retrain some strategies around that comfort food mechanism piece. Okay. Maybe it's more on the opposite end of the spectrum, right? We kind of talked about sugar cravings. We kind of talked about salt cravings. We kind of talked about here like comfort food cravings. What if it's on the other end of the spectrum where we're losing appetite or kind of losing tastes? I would say one of the most common ones that I see is protein aversions. It's usually not my guys, but I have some guys that get this way. Mostly my ladies, they'll somewhere along the line end up inadvertently on a very low protein diet, or what they then start to justify as a plant-based diet. And they're like, I'm a vegetarian, I like to be vegan, I like to be plant-based. And that's all well and good if it's for the right ethical reasons. If it's more like because you stopped being able to digest and absorb or process protein, and you just kind of slowly worked protein out of your diet because you realized that the only thing that felt good was carbs and fats, that's a sign. That's a sign of probably more some digestive capacity issues. I would really start to dig into stomach acid production. I'd start to dig into pancreatic enzymes. I'd start to dig into the liver detoxification pathways. Are we creating enough bile? Do we have proper gallbladder function? Like all of those things that happen. Usually protein aversions are someone that tells me they're like very picky about proteins, or like I don't like a lot of proteins. I immediately start to dig into their digestive capacity, because usually it's not necessarily that. It's the fact that their body can't break down and absorb protein. It doesn't have the functional machinery anymore. And so because of that, we have to reignite that. We have to reverse that back. So I would say protein aversions are going to tell me a lot about nutrient deficiencies, low stomach acid, poor digestive capacity. So a lot of times when we live in a state of chronic stress, or we're in that fight or flight state for days, weeks, months, years, even decades, gradually that stomach acid production goes down as a byproduct of that. So I usually will see a lot of times it'll be, like I said, individuals that come in and they're like, yeah, it was maybe 5-10 years of just like some chronic stressors, whether they knew it or not. And then by the end of that 10 years, they're plant-based now. And I'm like, take me back. Like, you used to eat meat? And they're like, oh yeah, I used to eat meat all the time. And now I just kind of lost the taste for it. I can't stomach it. It's like, it's a little bit of a flag for me to start to dig into that a little bit more, because they maybe didn't even realize that because of that stress and how they were living, they kind of destroyed their digestive capacity and their stomach acid. And so we need to recreate that in order to open up that protein intake again. And last but not least, I'll kind of get you even thinking more about like strictly appetite changes. I would say someone that feels hungry soon after eating, that could be some blood pressure issues, that could be some other hormonal issues around things like leptin resistance. Leptin is our satiety hormone. It is released from the fat cells of our body and travels to the brain and tells us that we're full. Well, when our brain doesn't have that, or we get this leptin resistance pattern, our body doesn't really have that right fullness cutoff switch, right? So some of this can precede, it can kind of happen before an insulin resistance pattern. Some of this is also related to what we call circadian rhythm dysfunction, like we're out of touch with nature, our body doesn't have good sleep-wake cycles, and overall our metabolism is a little bit, just like I said, off and confused. So that's usually what I dig into for individuals that kind of aren't satiated, and it's not a blood sugar thing, and kind of ruling that out as well too. So lots of different ways that our body can communicate things like cravings, things like appetite changes to us. And personally, I am very passionate about helping people learn how to interpret these cues and to adjust their nutrition, their lifestyle, their nervous system regulation, their movement accordingly, and not just come and sweep in with things like appetite suppressants or sugar detoxes or cleanse, because it's not going to work. You didn't address the underlying cause. You take the appetite suppressant off and all of the same shit still exists. That's probably my biggest fear of utilizing or leaning on things like these weight loss drugs as like an end all be all without really digging into like what got me into this situation in the first place. If we're using those things properly and we're understanding like, okay, how am I going to regulate my hunger, satiety, appetite, cravings naturally by learning how to understand food, learning how to fuel my body properly, learning how to move and manage my stress and my cortisol and release those past things off of my body, then I feel more confident about that person actually having an exit strategy from an appetite suppressing modality or a drug. But most people aren't using them that way. They're just like, this is great. I don't have to change anything. It's just making me less hungry and I can go about my day. But then what if they're not on that? Like, it all comes back with vengeance. And that's probably the biggest big red flag that kind of comes up for me around these things. So don't suppress your appetite. Don't just like curb your cravings. It's more about stepping back and staying curious about them and really seeing, what is this telling about me? What is this telling about my body? If you're curious about digging into more of these types of connections between nutrition, lifestyle, nervous system regulation, supplementation, movement, and how it impacts our health and our hormone balance, you would be a perfect candidate for my upcoming program, which launches on July 1st, which is just a few days away. My Revive, Restore, Renew You program. It is a 16-week program where we're going to get comprehensive labs. You're going to get monthly coaching sessions with me. You'll have tons of modules, downloadable resources, and ebooks to really take this 16-week experience and come out the other side learning how to manage all of this with your own internal pharmacy. So if you're interested in that, I'll be sure to drop the link into the caption of this video. And you can also click on the link in my bio to get registered for that, because we kick off on July 1st. So hope to see you guys all there. And if nothing else, come back for more Learn with Flo. A couple weeks from now, we'll skip the July 4th holiday Monday, and we'll be back that second week of July with more.